March 17th, 1889. Lexington, Kentucky. When groundskeeper Thomas Whitmore drove his pitchfork into the aged manure pile behind Ashford Estate's main stable, he expected to find nothing but compressed waste destined for the spring gardens. Instead, his tool struck something solid, something that shouldn't have been there. He pulled back layers of decomposed straw and horse waste, his hands working faster as a shape emerged. First he saw fabric, a torn sleeve, once white, now stained beyond recognition. Then bone. A small hand, fingers still curled as if grasping for something in those final moments. Thomas stumbled backward, his breakfast rising in his throat. But it wasn't just one body. As stable hands began excavating the massive pile under the supervision of the Fayette County Sheriff, they would uncover 5 more sets of remains. All young men. All between the ages of 14 and 17. All apprentices who had vanished over the previous 3 years from one of Kentucky's most prestigious equestrian training facilities. But the truth was far more terrifying than anyone in Lexington's elite society could have imagined. Before we uncover the truth about the horse trainer's apprentice murders and the dark secret hidden within an elite equestrian facility, make sure to subscribe to the Silent Abbey and ring that notification bell so you never miss our investigations into history's darkest corners. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers around the world. Now let's step back to 1886, to a time when Lexington, Kentucky was known as the horse capital of the world, and discover how ambition, secrecy, and unchecked power created the perfect conditions for unspeakable evil. The year 1886 marked a golden age for Kentucky's thoroughbred industry. In the aftermath of the Civil War, Southern aristocracy sought to rebuild their fortunes and reputations through the breeding and training of championship horses. Lexington, with its limestone-rich soil and bluegrass pastures, became the epicenter of this equestrian renaissance. The city's economy revolved around horse farms that stretched across thousands of acres. Wealthy northern industrialists purchased estates alongside old plantation families, all seeking prestige in the racing world. A single championship horse could be worth tens of thousands of dollars, a fortune in the 1880s, and the trainers who produced these champions commanded enormous respect and influence. Into this world came Marcus Ashford, a 43-year-old horseman who had trained winning mounts in England before immigrating to America in 1883. Ashford arrived with impeccable references from European racing circles, a charming demeanor, and an almost supernatural ability to transform unruly colts into obedient, winning thoroughbreds. Within 2 years he had established Ashford Estate, a 200-acre facility on the outskirts of Lexington. The estate was magnificent by any standard. A 3-story manor house overlooked pristine training tracks, 4 large stables, and quarters for the dozens of staff required to maintain such an operation. Ashford employed grooms, farriers, veterinarians, and stable hands. But his most prized workers were his apprentices, young men, typically from poor families, whom Ashford personally selected and promised to train in the art of horsemanship. Mr. Ashford had a way about him, wrote Sarah Hennings, a local seamstress, in her diary entry from July 1886. He'd come to town in his fine carriage, dressed like a gentleman, and he'd seek out families with strong sons who had no prospects. He promised them 3 years of training, room and board, and a recommendation that would secure their future in any stable from Virginia to California. What parent wouldn't leap at such an opportunity? The apprenticeship program seemed like a godsend to Lexington's working poor, boys who might have faced a lifetime of backbreaking. Labor in coal mines or factories could instead learn a respected trade. Ashford was selective, choosing only the most physically capable and, notably, those from families with limited social connections. He preferred orphans or boys from families with no other male children. By late 1886, Ashford Estate had trained 6 apprentices. The community celebrated these success stories. When an apprentice completed his 3-year term, Ashford would host a small ceremony, present the young man with a letter of recommendation, and send him on his way to prestigious stables across the country, or so everyone believed. But there were whispers, quiet observations that some didn't notice or chose to ignore. Mrs. Eleanor Pritchard, who ran a boarding house in town, later told investigators that she'd found it peculiar how none of those boys ever came back to visit their families, even after they'd supposedly made good elsewhere. When she'd mentioned this to friends, they'd dismissed her concerns. "Those boys are making their fortunes," they'd say. "Why would they want to return to poverty?" The spring of 1887 brought new apprentices. Among them was Daniel Fletcher, age 15, the youngest son of a widow who cleaned houses for wealthy families. Daniel's older brother, William, worked as a clerk at Lexington's First National Bank. Unlike most apprentice families, the Fletchers had someone who asked questions. The first incident that should have raised alarm occurred on June 12, 1887. William Fletcher arrived at Ashford Estate unannounced, hoping to visit his younger brother on Daniel's 16th birthday. He brought a small cake their mother had baked and a new pair of work gloves. When he reached the main house, Marcus Ashford himself answered the door. According to William's testimony given 2 years later, Ashford was polite but firm. The trainer explained that apprentices were not permitted family visits during their first year of training. It's essential they form bonds with the horses and commit fully to their education without the distraction of outside attachments, Ashford had said. You understand, I'm sure. It's for Daniel's own benefit. William left the cake and gloves but felt uneasy. There was something in Mr. Ashford's eyes he would later recall, a coldness that appeared for just a moment when I asked if I could at least see Daniel from a distance. He told me the boy was exercising horses in the far pastures and wouldn't return until evening. But as I walked back down the drive, I heard someone cry out from one of the stables, a young voice in pain. When I turned back, Mr. Ashford was watching me from the doorway, and he smiled, just smiled, and slowly closed the door. William filed no complaint. Who would believe him over Marcus Ashford, a man who had dinner with judges and congressmen? The second incident came that autumn. A traveling veterinarian named Dr. Henry Blackwood was called to Ashford Estate to treat a valuable mare with colic. While treating the animal, he noticed something unusual in the main stable's tack room. Restraints attached to the wall, the kind used to control difficult horses, but sized for something smaller, much smaller. I asked Mr. Ashford about them, Dr. Blackwood told the Inquiry Commission in 1889. He laughed and said they were for training young horses to accept grooming and medical examination. But I'd been a veterinarian for 20 years, and I'd never seen such equipment. The leather straps were worn smooth, used frequently, and there were stains on them, dark stains that looked like old blood. Dr. Blackwood mentioned his observations to 2 colleagues. Both dismissed his concerns. Ashford trains champions, one said. Whatever methods he uses, they work. Winter 1887 brought the third incident, and this one was harder to ignore. A fire broke out in one of the smaller stables on December 3rd. The blaze was contained quickly, damaging only one building. But fire inspect. Or James Good noticed something troubling during his investigation. In the burned-out structure's corner, he found a locked room that wasn't on the estate's official plans, a hidden chamber behind a false wall. Inside, once the door was broken open, Good discovered a narrow space, no more than 8 feet by 6 feet, with no windows. There was a cot with restraints attached to its frame, a chamber pot, and nothing else. The walls bore scratch marks, as if someone had clawed at the wood with their fingernails. Good reported his findings to Sheriff Thomas Garrett. The sheriff visited Ashford Estate that same day. Ashford's explanation was smooth and reasonable. The room had been used to isolate a mentally disturbed stable hand years ago before Ashford purchased the property. I'd forgotten it was even there, Ashford claimed. The previous owner must have built it. You know how some of these old estates have their secrets. Sheriff Garrett accepted the explanation. After all, Marcus Ashford had contributed generously to the sheriff's re-election campaign. But not everyone was convinced. William Fletcher, who had heard about the fire through town gossip, visited the sheriff's office 3 times in December and January, asking about his brother. Daniel had now been at the estate for 8 months, and William had received only 1 letter from him, a brief note in November that seemed strangely formal and unlike Daniel's usual casual writing. My brother knew only basic letters, William told Sheriff Garrett. He could sign his name and read simple words, but this letter used phrases he'd never heard of. Someone else wrote it, I'm certain. The sheriff promised to look into the matter but took no action. The fourth and final incident before the discovery should have ended everything right then. On February 23, 1888, a young man stumbled onto the main road 3 miles from Ashford Estate. His name was Peter Donovan, age 17, and he had been an apprentice at the estate for 11 months. He was emaciated, covered in bruises, and his left arm hung at an unnatural angle. A passing farmer found him collapsed in a ditch and brought him to Dr. Charles Morton's clinic in town. Peter was delirious with fever and fear. In his lucid moments, he spoke of the basement room and the training and the others who didn't survive the lessons. He mentioned names: Daniel, Fletcher, Robert Hayes, Timothy Cole, boys who were supposedly working at stables across the country. Dr. Morton documented Peter's injuries, multiple healed fractures, signs of prolonged malnutrition. extensive scarring on his back consistent with repeated whipping, and signs of psychological trauma so severe the young man flinched at any sudden movement. But before Dr. Morton could report these findings to authorities, Marcus Ashford arrived at the clinic. He brought with him two men, a lawyer and Dr. Edmund Price, a physician known to treat Lexington's wealthy elite. Dr. Price examined Peter and declared him mentally unsound, suffering from delusions brought on by a fall from a horse. The boy hit his head during training, Ashford explained to Dr. Morton and the gathered onlookers. He's been prone to fits of imagination since the accident. I had hoped treatment here might help him, but I see now he needs to be moved to a proper facility for the mentally disturbed. Peter Donovan was removed from Dr. Morton's clinic that same day. Ashford promised he would be taken to a sanatorium in Louisville for proper care. No one ever saw Peter Donovan again. Dr. Morton, troubled by what he'd witnessed, wrote a letter to the state medical board describing Peter's injuries and his concerns about the young man's sudden removal. The letter was received, filed, and forgotten. Marcus Ashford was simply too important, too connected, too respectable to be accused of wrongdoing based on the ravings of an injured stable boy. The community's willingness to look away, to rationalize, to defer to power and prestige. These choices would haunt Lexington for generations. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button and share this with someone who loves dark mysteries. The discovery we're about to discuss next changed everything and exposed a horror that had been hiding in plain sight for 3 years. Let's discover what happens next. March 17, 1889. The day truth came to Ashford Estate. Thomas Whitmore had worked as a groundskeeper at the estate for only 6 weeks. He'd been hired specifically for the spring season to prepare the gardens and manage the massive accumulation of manure from the stables. At 47 years old, Whitmore was a veteran of the Civil War, a man not easily shaken. But what he uncovered that cool spring morning would haunt him until his death 32 years later. The manure pile stood against the back wall of the main stable, a mountain of decomposed horse waste, straw, and organic matter that had accumulated for nearly 3 years. It was common practice to let such piles age before using them as fertilizer, allowing the heat of decomposition to kill parasites and break down the material. This particular pile measured roughly 20 feet across and 8 feet high at its peak. I started at the eastern edge, Whitmore testified during the trial. My intention was to load the aged material into wagons for distribution across the fields. I'd been working perhaps 20 minutes when my pitchfork struck something that wasn't manure. At first, I thought it might be an old saddle or piece of tack that had been thrown out, but as I cleared away the material, I saw cloth. And then I saw the hand. Whitmore immediately stopped working and ran to find the estate's foreman, Douglas McCarthy. McCarthy, who had worked at Ashford Estate since its opening, initially dismissed Whitmore's concerns. Probably a dead dog or cat, McCarthy said. The stable hands sometimes bury animals in the pile, but Whitmore insisted McCarthy come see for himself. What they found sent McCarthy running for the main house to summon Marcus Ashford himself. The body was small, clearly human, and had been in the manure pile for at least a year based on the state of decomposition. The acidic nature of the manure had acted as a kind of preservation agent, similar to bodies found in peat bogs. While the remains were skeletal in places, much of the clothing was intact, and some tissue remained. Marcus Ashford arrived at the pile within minutes, accompanied by his personal secretary, Vincent Hall. According to Whitmore's testimony, Ashford's face went white as church paint when he saw the partially exposed body, but he composed himself quickly and ordered Whitmore and McCarthy to stop their work immediately. "This is clearly one of the vagrant boys who sometimes sleep in our stables," Ashford said, his voice steady. "Poor wretch must have burrowed into the pile for warmth during the winter and suffocated. A tragedy, but these things happen. I'll notify the sheriff." But Thomas Whitmore had spent 2 decades as a battlefield surgeon's assistant during the war. He had seen more dead men than he could count, and he knew what he was looking at. "Mr. Ashford," he said, "that boy's hands are bound behind his back with wire." The words hung in the air like cannon smoke. Ashford stared at Whitmore for a long moment, then turned to McCarthy. "Summon the sheriff," he said quietly, "and keep everyone away from this area." Sheriff Thomas Garrett arrived at Ashford Estate 90 minutes later. With him came his deputy, Frank Morrison, and the county coroner, Dr. Albert Sykes. What began as the investigation of a single suspicious death rapidly evolved into something far worse. Dr. Sykes supervised the careful excavation of the first body. The remains belonged to a male between 15 and 18 years of age. His hands were indeed bound with wire behind his back. More troubling, his skull showed signs of massive trauma. A crushing blow to the back of the head. His clothing, once cleaned of manure, included a work shirt with a name sewn into the collar. D. Fletcher. William Fletcher, who had been frantically searching for news of his brother for over a year, was called to the estate. His identification of Daniel's shirt remains one of the most heartbreaking moments in Kentucky legal history. He was wearing it the day Mother and I said goodbye to him, William told the investigators, his voice breaking. She'd sewn his name into all his clothes so they wouldn't get mixed up with the other boys' things. My brother was murdered, and we looked away. But Daniel Fletcher wasn't alone in that pile of death. As workers continued excavating under Dr. Sykes's supervision, they found a second body 3 feet from the first, then a third, then a fourth. Each body showed signs of trauma. Each had their hands bound. Each was clothed in the simple work garments of stable hands. By nightfall on March 17th, 6 bodies had been recovered from the manure pile. The victims were identified over the following days through clothing, personal effects, and dental records. Daniel Fletcher, 15. Robert Hayes, 16. Timothy Cole, 14. James Sullivan, 17. Peter Donovan, 17, the boy who had escaped and been taken away by Ashford. And Michael Brennan, 16. All had been apprentices at Ashford Estate. All had supposedly left to take positions at other stables. All had been murdered and hidden in the waste pile, where Ashford believed they would decompose into nothing, just another layer of organic matter to feed his champion horse's pastures. The horror of it shook Lexington to its core. These weren't strangers killed by bandits on lonely roads. These were boys from their community, murdered in plain sight at a respected estate, while the entire town celebrated the success of Marcus Ashford's training program. Marcus Ashford was arrested on the evening of March 17, 1889, and held without bail in the Fayette County Jail. His arrest sent shockwaves through Kentucky's elite society. Within days, more horrifying details emerged as investigators searched Ashford Estate with unprecedented thoroughness. In the basement of the main stable building, they discovered what Peter Donovan had called the training room during his brief escape. It was a chamber of horrors that revealed the true nature of Ashford's training methods. The room, hidden behind a false wall of hay bales, measured approximately 15 feet by 20 feet. The walls were lined with implements of torture, whips, chains, restraints, and devices designed to cause maximum pain while leaving minimal visible scarring. There was a wooden table with leather straps, a chair with metal restraints built into its arms and legs, and a series of cages barely large enough to hold a full-grown man in a crouched position. Most disturbing were the journals. Marcus Ashford had kept meticulous records of his training sessions with his apprentices, written in coded language that investigators would spend weeks deciphering. These journals detailed 3 years of systematic torture, psychological abuse, and ultimately, murder. Ashford's writings revealed a disturbing philosophy. He believed young men, like young horses, needed to be broken before they could be properly trained. But unlike horses, which Ashford treated with relative care given their monetary value, the apprentices were his personal experiments in control and domination. Subject DF shows persistent resistance to training protocols. One entry from October 1887 read, "Applied standard braking techniques for 3 hours. Subject broke 2 ribs during restraint but maintains defiant attitude. May require permanent solution if improvement not shown." The permanent solution had been delivered to Daniel Fletcher in January 1888. A blow to the head with a farrier's hammer, followed by disposal in the manure P. As investigators pieced together the timeline, a horrifying pattern emerged. Ashford would select apprentices specifically from vulnerable families, orphans, youngest sons, boys whose disappearance wouldn't cause sustained investigation. He'd keep them isolated on the estate, allowing no visitors, controlling all communication. The training was actually systematic abuse designed to break the young men's spirits completely. Those who proved submissive enough might be given actual stable work, though still under constant surveillance and threat. Those who resisted, who maintained any sense of independence or dignity, were subjected to escalating torture. When an apprentice became too broken, too injured, or too defiant, Ashford would kill them and dispose of their bodies in the manure pile. He'd then write letters to their families in the victim's name, explaining that they'd accepted positions at distant stables. Given that many of the victims came from barely literate families, these forgeries were rarely questioned. The estate staff came under intense scrutiny. How could such horrors occur with dozens of workers on the grounds? The answer was a combination of fear, compartmentalization, and willful ignorance. Vincent Hall, Ashford's secretary, was arrested as an accomplice. He'd helped forge the letters to families and had assisted in disposing of at least 2 bodies. Douglas McCarthy, the foreman, claimed he'd suspected nothing, but investigators found evidence suggesting he'd heard screams from the basement room and chosen to ignore them. Most of the stable hands and household staff genuinely appeared to have known nothing specific. Ashford had compartmentalized his crimes carefully. The apprentices were kept separate from other workers. The basement room was accessible only through a locked door that only Ashford and Hall had keys to. Any suspicious sounds could be explained away as difficult horses being trained, but some workers had noticed things and said nothing. A cook mentioned hearing screams in the night but assumed it was just horses being broken. A stable hand had once seen Ashford drag a crying apprentice toward the basement, the boy's face covered in blood, but had convinced himself it was just harsh discipline, the willingness of the community to defer to Ashford's authority, to trust his reputation over their own observations had created an environment where murder could flourish unchecked. The trial of Marcus Ashford began on July 15, 1889, and became one of the most publicized criminal proceedings in Kentucky history. Newspapers across the country covered every detail. The prosecution, led by State's Attorney George Whitman, built an overwhelming case. Physical evidence from the estate, the journals, testimony from investigators, statements from families, and the forensic evidence from the bodies themselves all pointed to Ashford's guilt. Vincent Hall offered a plea bargain in exchange for testimony, provided detailed accounts of Ashford's crimes, including witnessing at least 3 murders. Ashford's defense attorneys, led by the prominent criminal lawyer Charles Hartford, attempted to argue that their client was insane, that no rational person could commit such acts. They brought in psychiatrists who testified about moral insanity and degeneracy. They painted Ashford as a victim of his own twisted mind, deserving of treatment rather than execution. The prosecution countered that Ashford's meticulous planning, his careful selection of vulnerable victims, his elaborate cover-up, and his successful deception of the community for 3 years, all demonstrated clear calculation and awareness of his actions. This was not insanity, this was evil. The jury deliberated for 7 hours. They found Marcus Ashford guilty on 6 counts of first-degree murder. On August 3, 1889, Judge Harold Thompson sentenced Marcus Ashford to death by hanging. Reading from a prepared statement, Judge Thompson said, "You exploited the trust of the innocent, the hope of the desperate, and the deference of the community to commit acts of such depravity that they challenge our understanding of human nature. You took young men who came to you seeking a better future and subjected them to horrors that defy description. The law demands justice. The families of your victims demand justice. God himself demands justice." Marcus Ashford was executed by hanging on November 12, 1889, at the Kentucky State Penitentiary in Frankfort. According to witnesses, his final words were, "I regret only that I was discovered." He showed no remorse for his victims. Vincent Hall received a sentence of 20 years in prison for his role as an accomplice. He served 16 years before being released in 1905. He moved to California and lived under an assumed name until his death in 1923. Douglas McCarthy, the foreman, was never charged criminally, though he lived under a cloud of suspicion for the rest of his life. He left Lexington shortly after the trial and died in obscurity in 1902. The families of the victims faced their own difficult aftermath. William Fletcher became an advocate for child labor reform and founded a small organization to help families of crime victims navigate the legal system. He never married, dedicating his life to honoring his brother's memory. Daniel wanted to make something of himself, William wrote in 1910. He deserved that chance, they all did. The Fletcher family received no compensation from Ashford's estate, which was liquidated to pay legal fees. The land was eventually purchased by a consortium of horse breeders who demolished all the buildings and removed any trace of the horror that had occurred there. The Ashford estate murders exposed fundamental flaws in Kentucky's labor laws and revealed how easily authority could be abused when combined with social prestige and systemic deference. In the immediate aftermath of the trial, the Kentucky State Legislature passed the Apprentice Protection Act of 1890. This law required all apprenticeship arrangements to be registered with the county clerk, mandated quarterly inspections of any facility housing underage workers, and established a requirement for regular family visits. Any employer who prevented family contact could face criminal charges. The law was groundbreaking for its time but revealed how little protection had existed before. Young workers had been essentially at the mercy of their employers, with no oversight and no recourse if abused. The Ashford case demonstrated that this wasn't merely a theoretical concern, it was a deadly reality. The case also sparked a broader conversation about the dangers of blind deference to social status and reputation. Editorials in newspapers across the country pointed out that multiple people had noticed suspicious circumstances at Ashford Estate: William Fletcher, Dr. Blackwood, Fire Inspector Good, Dr. Morton. But their concerns had been dismissed because they contradicted the image of Marcus Ashford as a respectable gentleman. "We must ask ourselves," wrote the editor of the Lexington Herald on August 10, 1889, "how many other horrors hide behind the facade of respectability? How many crimes go unreported because the accused is wealthy, well-connected, or simply well-liked?" The young men who died at Ashford Estate were sacrificed not only to one man's depravity but to our community's unwillingness to question authority. The psychological impact on Lexington's community was profound. Families became hesitant to send their children into apprenticeships. The entire thoroughbred industry faced scrutiny as investigators examined other training facilities, though no evidence of similar crimes was found. Trust between social classes, already strained in the post-Civil War South, deteriorated further. Several other cases emerged in the years following the trial that suggested Ashford may not have been unique. In 1891, a stable owner in Virginia was convicted of killing 2 apprentices, though the murders had occurred before the Ashford case came to light. In 1893, a training facility in Pennsylvania was shut down after investigators found evidence of systematic abuse, though no bodies were discovered. These cases suggested a dark underbelly to the apprenticeship system, one where vulnerable young people could be exploited, abused, or killed with minimal risk of discovery, especially if the perpetrator occupied a position of social prominence. The case also raised questions about institutional failure. Why had Sheriff Garrett ignored William Fletcher's repeated concerns? Why had the state medical board taken no action on Dr. Morton's letter? Why had so many people chosen to look away from obvious warning signs? The answer, uncomfortable as it remains, is that institutions often protect their own interests over the vulnerable. Sheriff Garrett had accepted campaign contributions from Ashford. The medical board was reluctant to question a wealthy patient's physician. Social norms dictated deference to the wealthy and powerful. All these factors combined to create an environment where justice could be delayed or denied entirely. The families of the victims filed wrongful death lawsuits against Ashford's estate, seeking compensation for their losses. While they won their cases, the estate was effectively bankrupt after legal fees, and the families received minimal settlements, typically less than $500 per victim, equivalent to perhaps $15,000 in today's currency. No amount of money could restore what had been taken, but the paltry sums added insult to the tragedy. In the decades that followed, the Ashford estate murders became a cautionary tale taught in law schools and criminal justice programs. The case is frequently cited in discussions of serial murder, institutional failure, and the importance of protecting vulnerable populations. Perhaps the most lasting impact was on how society views the intersection of authority and oversight. The idea that powerful figures should be subject to the same scrutiny as anyone else, that wealth and status should not provide immunity from investigation, gained significant traction in progressive-era reforms that followed in the early 1900s. The site of Ashford Estate remained empty land for decades. Local legend held it to be cursed, and few people would venture onto the property after dark. In the 1920s, the land was purchased and subdivided for residential development, though even today some residents of that neighborhood report feeling an inexplicable sadness when walking past what was once the location of the main stable. A small memorial was erected in 1925 at Lexington's Calvary Cemetery, where the 6 victims were eventually reburied together. The monument bears their names and a simple inscription: "They sought only opportunity. They deserved justice. They receive remembrance." Every year on March 17th, descendants of the victims and advocates for vulnerable workers gather at the memorial for a brief ceremony. It serves as a reminder that the price of looking away from injustice is measured not just in individual tragedy but in the erosion of the moral foundations of society itself. The question the Ashford case poses remains relevant today. How many horrors exist in plain sight, dismissed because we find it easier to trust comfortable narratives than to confront uncomfortable truths? How many victims suffer in silence because speaking up requires challenging someone with authority, wealth, or social standing? These are not historical questions. They are eternal ones, and the 6 young men buried beneath the manure pile at Ashford Estate paid the ultimate price for our failure to ask them soon enough. What do you think drove Marcus Ashford to such acts? Was it pure sadism, a twisted need for control, or something even darker in his psychology? More importantly, why did so many people in positions of authority ignore the WA? Are ending signs? Leave your theories in the comments below. This case raises difficult questions about how we balance respect for authority with the need to protect the vulnerable. I'm interested to hear your perspective on what could have been done differently. If this video opened your eyes to a dark chapter of history you'd never heard of before, please subscribe to The Silent Abbey for more lost and disturbing chapters of our past. History isn't just about the famous figures and celebrated moments, it's also about the forgotten victims and the uncomfortable truths we'd rather not face. Thank you for watching, and remember, the past speaks to us if we're willing to listen even when what it has to say is terrifying. See you in the next video,